Hey everyone, welcome to Next Up Live. This is NXTsoft's live interview series where we take a look at cybersecurity and fintech, those two industries, and lots of trends within them, some topical material, and kind of looking a little bit behind the curtain at what's happening here at NXTsoft and talking with some of our employees. So today, I get to welcome, and here is Tom with me today. Tom, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Ben. I'm enjoying it already.
Yeah. Tom is Senior Vice President and Consultant for NextSoft's OmniLytics platform. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and we will be talking asset liability management, which is the specialty for OmniLytics. So ALM, IRR, all that good stuff. So stay tuned. I hope you guys enjoy this. I always enjoy talking to you, Tom, so this is going to be fun.
I
Um,
always enjoy talking to you and talking ALM.
So ALM, let's start there. Like ALM. If I am a banker or if I work at a credit union, what is my relationship to ALM? What do I think about when I hear ALM? Is it a love hate thing? Is it a necessary evil? What does that look like?
Yeah, it does sometimes have a bad rep. And if you're unless you're in the finance and accounting department, certainly the senior management or on the asset liability committee, you'll hear me say that, and I'll call it ALCO for future reference. But you might not even know what it's all about. You say love-hate relationship, and that's certainly true. That really stems from the fact that it is something that is required by the regulators. And it simply put, banks, credit unions, thrifts, financial institutions of all sorts, they need to evaluate the value at risk when interest rates change, and the earnings at risk when earnings change. And that's just, when you think about it, just good business practice anyway. That asset liability management is banking. It's the process. A banker manages assets and liabilities, hopefully optimizing them so that their interest margin is wide enough in order to pay the bills, keep the lights on, and make a profit for the shareholders. So, on the one hand, ALM is just banking and good business. On the other hand, the regulatory required analysis that they do is often looked at as something that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because what they're being asked to do is create scenarios and look at scenarios in a way that it is sort of a real low probability but high impact situation. And what I mean by that, and I use that term a lot, low impact, low probability, high impact. What I mean by that is it's unlikely to happen. In other words, interest rates are unlikely to jump immediately and across the board and all the way up 400 basis points and just stay there for a year. But that's what you have to do. So it's unlikely, but if it were to happen, it would be really bad. So uh, the the necessary evil part is, yeah, they got to do it, and they can't quite figure out how they can take the results of that and actually kind of integrate it into their own decision making and strategic thinking. And so they look at it as something that they just do. They check the box and they put it on the shelf and for later, and show the regulators that they're actually doing it.
Right. So I guess it's kind of a high investment for what seems to be very low payoff, right?
That's the way it's viewed, but if done right or done correctly, you can glean a lot of information out of it. There are you could take it. I mean, good practitioners would take it beyond just this kind of parallel, immediate, sustained rate shock, and start to create scenarios that are maybe more realistic, like maybe rates rise, but they rise more gradually over time. And what's the impact of that? And that would just be good business planning, is saying, let's do a forecast of interest rates and of our balance sheet, and try to make some assumptions around that, and what do we look like at the end of 12 months or at the end of 24 months. And a lot of the regulators do suggest that. In fact, they require it in many cases. So it's not something that's unheard of, but
Hmm.
many of these people we work with, they wear a lot of hats. And if we're talking about a community banker, he's probably making loan decisions, sitting in on committees, and then he also has to spend time once a month or once a quarter assembling a lot of detailed information in order to produce these regulatory reports that they look at and say, well, okay, that's done, and I can't really do anything with it. So it becomes kind of a burden, and they'll do the minimum that they need to get by, and they don't really get a whole lot out of it, but they got to spend money doing it at the same time.
All right, so it ends up being real time consuming and tedious to that particular individual.
Yeah, it really can, and there are a number of reasons for that as well. One is you have to gather all the information, which would be detailed loan data from your core processing system, from your banking system. So usually means a download of data and then an import of data. Well, of course, then when you import data, you get errors. Maybe you have new products or loans that you've made. They're not set up in the system, and you need to set up all the variables around those and so that they're calculated correctly. And then there are other variables that are outside of the core system which influence the results. And primarily those would be things like deposit behaviors. So, you make a deposit, like a savings deposit, and you want to evaluate, how valuable is that deposit to the bank, because that's part of the equation. Well, how do you do that? You got to have some assumptions around that, and one of those is called decay. How long is that going to stick around? Well, we don't really look at the individual accounts, but we look at groups of them, and we say, well, if we were to leave these accounts alone, how long would it be before they just disappear from the balance sheet? And you have to go through some quite complex calculations to come up with that. But here's the thing: the examiners want you to do that, or at least get it done. And because it's an important assumption in the model, in the calculation, and they want you to use assumptions that are realistic to your organization, what we call bank specific, institution specific. You can't just go out into the industry and say, oh, well, what's everyone else doing? Or just say, we'll use that. Because then an examiner will say, oh, no. You can't use that. You don't have anything supporting the use of that assumption. So we want you to go out and take a closer look. So again, tedious. You got to go out, gather the data, do the research, do the results, gather the results. And so you have deposit decays, you have things like prepayment on loans, how fast your loans pay off if rates change. Well, that differs from geographic location and bank to bank and credit union to credit union. So that's something that has to be looked at as well. And so these assumptions, documenting the assumptions and using appropriate assumptions necessary for the operation of the model is a time-consuming process.
So I know where you're going here, Tom, because I know this is what you do, right? I know you're headed towards, look, the obvious solution is outsourcing, right? Outsource to the experts who this is all they do. They know, how to do it, and you can free yourself up for more kind of direct banking tasks. But let me play a little devil's advocate here. Even with outsourcing, because I know there's some different opinions here. Even with outsourcing, a financial institution still has to have someone internally to manage that relationship, right? So that's still time and effort. So why not just stick to a self-run model in that scenario?
You mean sticking with just an application installed at the organization? Right. Well, exactly. A few things. Well, technology changes fast, first of all, and it's a lot easier to deploy new technology over the cloud. And so we don't really want this old application software sitting on the server. But there are those who still do, and they think that they're saving money. They might be running something that's antiquated, but has been getting by. There's a really funny story I have for you, and this goes back 20 years ago to the Millennium Bug, if you all remember that.
Oh yeah.
We thought that all the software was just going to shut down and fail, and so at the time, the company I worked with had this DOS-based software. We also had new software, and we were encouraging everybody to convert to the new software because we thought the old software would dim the lights and shut down at midnight on January 1st. And we were mostly successful in doing that. But about 3 years later, 5 years later, I was talking to a banker and I was saying, you're still running this old system. I go, what happened? He said, yeah, well, January 1st came and went and the software kept working. So I'm still. So he's still, 5 years later on this old DOS version he thought was just fine. Well, then a few years later, let's say he didn't upgrade at the time. He just kept using it. But 3 years later, we had a pretty bad meltdown in the economy. And some of the analysis that he needed to do just didn't exist in that old DOS software that was created in the early 90s, maybe even late 80s, I don't know. So by thinking that you're getting by and saving money by running something local or by yourself, you're not always keeping up with what the regulatory requirement and burden is. Secondly, if you outsource to an expert, somebody who's a subject matter expert, what you're really doing is you're hiring them as your employee to be your subject matter expert, your ALM person on staff. So they will collect all the assumptions and do the assumption setting and analysis and collect all of the data and make sure the data balances. Your responsibility is to get the data, the loan data, because we don't have access to the loan system itself, but usually that's an automated process. In fact, OmniConnect, our sister division at NXTsoft, has APIs that will pull that data right in automatically anyway. So that even that burden is taken off the table. But we then do the processing, do the documentation. We have a checklist here that we've provided to our clients also that goes through and says, make sure you have this, 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 and this. Well, we do that for you. And so the checklist is done, and when your exam comes up, you don't get written up for it. The other thing is, with all the other stuff going on, the other hats you have to wear, you might not get to doing the analysis right away. By the time you're done, it's going to be stale. It's going to be maybe even incorrect. You might not trust the numbers. You might be a little bit worried about explaining the numbers to the examiners and the board. It might be wrong. Well, when you outsource, you've got somebody backing you up on that. But I also want to make a pretty clear distinction here about outsourcing versus just getting the reports done, because a lot of companies I talk to say, well, I outsource to my, say, broker dealer. They provide that. Well, they're not making sure that the assumptions are correct. They're not doing assumption studies or policy checking, policy updates on an annual basis. They're not doing vendor management for you, things like that. And they're pretty much just taking the data, running a report and sending it back to you for free. But then, what you don't know how to explain it to the board, to the examiners. You might not trust the numbers, things like that. So yeah, it's free, but at what cost? And usually there's a soft dollar cost there too, because you have to maintain that broker-dealer relationship and buy bonds from them in order to get that free report. So there's outsourcing and there's just service providing, and those are two totally different things.
Sure. Thanks for making that distinction. And you mentioned that ALM checklist. If you are watching the stream, we're going to drop a link below in the comments for you guys to access that on our site as well. So Tom, you're arguing that outsourcing is going to get more reliable results. You'll trust the numbers better, and you'll feel more confident going into your exam. Is that right?
That's exactly right. For relatively few dollars, and no benefits paid, you're getting an employee on staff and freeing up all that time for you to get on to doing other things, to get back to banking, is like I like to say.
Awesome. All right. Well, speaking of getting on to other things, I'm going to release you now from this. I appreciate your time this morning, Tom, and I hope that those of you who are watching got some value out of this. So, Tom, thanks again for joining me.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Good talking to you.
You too. All right, guys. We'll see you next time.